Well, hello my friends, hope you are well. Today I'm back working on my kitbashed 40k Swamperial Guard army build, and I'll be whipping up this angry little Commissar to keep all of our other green boys in line. Let's get into it.
Swamperial.
So the base for our Commissar is going to be a leftover Runtherd mini I had laying around from my previous Gretchen conversions. And before I get started with the main modifications, I'm just snipping, cutting and filing away any of the details that are kind of protruding around his belly and torso, as we don't want any little lumps and bumps making the addition of the green stuff any harder than it needs to be. I then glued his head into place and drilled a couple of holes into his feet so I could attach him to a handle, as this will make the sculpting and painting process a lot more ergonomic. And he was now ready for me to start sculpting in his commissarial attire, aka his clothes, you know, whatever. For my sculpting medium, I'm going to be using a 50-50 blend of green stuff and milliput together, as my recent attempt at scratch building a retro 40k librarian showed this to be a way more effective material than either of them used on their own. It's a lot less sticky and easier to smooth out than the green stuff, and it can be sanded down between each coat thanks to the milliput, meaning it's also a lot easier to correct any rougher looking areas. I use a small dot of super glue to attach each piece to the miniature, as this lets you really get in there with your sculpting tools without having to worry about pulling the piece off by accident while it's curing. And I'm making a start by building up the details around the chest and his big old gut, since these will be a lot more difficult to work on once I add the arms into place. I'm very loosely basing this mini on the old school Commissar, as I just really like the vibe he's got going on, so I tried to mimic the details on his chest by building up a kind of rib texture using my sculpting tools and a hobby knife. I gave these areas a bit of a sanding and filing out once they've cured, which helped to make the ribbed sections look a bit better, and then added a couple more details to finish this section off. First, I added some belts, for which I just used some thin straps of my greeny pup mixture, and once they were on, I just ran one of my sculpting tools down the lengths to give them a very subtle bevel through the centre. I then followed this up by adding a few buttons onto the ribbed section, which were made from tiny circles of greeny pup with an added dimple from my hobby knife, and I was pretty happy with how that was looking, so I could move on to the limbs. For the legs, I wanted to get some quite puffy looking trousers for the upper thighs, like the kind of riding trousers they wear in the military, so I gave them an initial layer of my greeny pup mixture, making sure to sculpt in some little lumps for the kneecaps. I was planning to finish these off with a second layer for some extra bulk and puffiness, but I needed to wait for the first one to cure fully first, which gave me a good opportunity to work on the arms in the meantime. Commissars can be equipped with either a bolt or plasma pistol, and personally I think the plasma pistol looks way cooler, so following my theme of form over function and rule of cool for this army, I'm going with the old double P for his right arm, and I just had to make some very slight alterations to the plasma pistol itself, as well as the arm of the Runtherd, which came together really well in the end, giving me this plasma pistol with a kind of orky twist from the handguard poking out. Pretty cool. I glued that arm into place, and for the second arm, the Commissar's usually equipped with a chain or power sword, and I did attach a chainsaw to his waist later on, but I really wanted to use the standard arm of the Runtherd pulling back this little guard squig, as I thought this would work really well with the vibe of the Commissar as a kind of angry guard dog gnashing away in everyone's faces, so that was an easy job with no alterations needed. After that, I glued on the first blobs of greeny pup for his kind of commander hat thing. I'm not really sure what you call these, but regardless, it would need to be built up in layers like everything else, so I sculpted in a visor shape first, and then stuck a bit on top to start adding the main bulk of it. And speaking of layers, the legs were now ready for their second helping of greeny part, which I just smoothed over while making sure to keep some level of separation between the thighs and the knees. It was now time to add the majority of his trench coat into place, but I first trimmed down some of the excess details on the arms and shoulders, as I didn't want these areas to look too bulky. It was then just a case of wrapping them in thin layers of greeny putt and smoothing them over as much as I could using my sculpting tools. They did look a bit on the chonky side from my first pass, but I was able to thin them down by filing and sanding them once they'd cured. I added another quick layer to his hat to continue progress there, and then I attached the large part of the coat onto his back, smoothing over the areas where it joined the arms and this fur shawl thing on top. This shawl was part of the original Runtherd miniature, and I left it in place as I thought it'd work well with the overcoat to give it a nice extra level of detail. But anyway, I gave the coat some very subtle definition just so it wouldn't look so flat and boring, and I was now starting to feel like this build was coming together. The main components had all been roughly sculpted in now, and I could finish everything off by adding the last layer of details, including the upper portion of his hat, which I sculpted into a nice upward point. Next, I worked on the coat a bit more and added some lapels with some collary bits poking out on each side of his face. And these bits were actually a nightmare to work on. I'm not sure if I was getting tired at this point or whatever, but yeah, they were super fiddly and a massive pain in the ass, but they did look pretty cool when they were finished, so I guess it was worth it in the end. I then added a cuff around the sleeve of his right arm as it was looking a bit empty here, added a little square patch on each shoulder because they were also looking a bit empty at this point, and then glued a chainsword onto his hip with a little belt attachment, just in case anyone wanted to be a stickler for the rules and say I couldn't use a squig as a proxy chain or power sword in actual gameplay. Finally, to finish everything off, I just wanted to bring some insignias into the mix as the last little details, as there's no way I'd be able to sculpt these to actually look good on such a small scale. So I basically just took some random Cadian items with aquillas on them, chopped the aquillas off them, and cleaned them up a bit to be left with these tiny little fragile things that I glued into place on the hat and each of the shoulder pads. And there we have it. There's our little Commissar, or our Swamperial. No, that doesn't work. And I'm actually really pleased with how this guy's turned out. Some of the sculpting's a little bit rough around the edges, as always, but I think overall he fits the vibe I'm going for and should be quite recognizable on the tabletop. So that means it's time to paint him up. Now, obviously I want this guy to fit in with the rest of our troops, so I'm going to be using the same colour scheme I've been doing so far in these builds, going with the kind of purple and dirty brown main colours with the nice vibrant green flesh in there for added pizzazz. But since I'm painting one miniature today only, instead of batch painting a group of infantry, I can really give him a bit more love and attention to help him stand out as more of an important miniature on the tabletop. And I say more of an important miniature quite loosely, to be honest, because the Commissar in the 10th edition rules of 40k is not really that good, and you'd probably be surprised to see him in most army lists, just because, yeah, he's just not very useful. There's some debate for him being more useful in the Death Corps of Krieg units, which I am planning to kitbash into this army eventually, but realistically, the usefulness of this miniature is probably like mid to non-existent in the grand scheme of things. But like I said earlier, and in my previous videos in this series, my main concern for this army is building a whole bunch of kitbashed Swamperial Guard crossover miniatures that appeal to me. And the Commissars have always appealed to me, both in sculpt and in premise. You know, I love the idea of these guys in the midst of the battlefield, maintaining morale through the threat of punishment and executions for any soldier displaying less than complete, unwavering bravery. And that also makes the Runtherd miniature a great foundation for this kitbash, as they pretty much do the same thing for the Snotlings and Gretchen, although with a slightly less punitive and a more friendly approach to their green brethren. So yeah, it may not be the most meta-minded addition to the army, but I just really love the idea of this chonky Runtherd Commissar in the field motivating and leading the smaller green boys. And it only costs 35 points, so even if I'm playing a smaller scale match at 1,000 points or something like that, I still get to have a really cool thematic miniature on the tabletop that fits the vibe of the army I'm building and still leaves me with 96.5% of my points to put towards more effective units. That makes it worth it for me, and if nothing else, I've had a ton of fun building and painting this guy, so he'll be a great addition to my army even if he's just there for photo shoots and never actually sees the tabletop. Not everything needs to be so meta-oriented, and you don't need to sweat your army list so hard. I know some people do get a lot of satisfaction around min-maxing and planning and building the army list to be as effective as possible, but if you're like me and just enjoy painting your minis and assembling armies based on what seems cool to you, then just do that. You might get smoked when you actually bring them to the table, but it's okay because your army will look really cool while they do so. To finish off this bad boy completely, I whipped up one of my usual swampy bases, dry brushing a couple of layers onto my homemade mud mixture after it's dried, and added in some of this swampy goo stuff too. I add a little bit of plant life, glue the miniature down, add a little bit more plant life, and then give him the customary rim job using some Steel Legion drab. Let's see how he came out. So there we have it, my friends. What do you think? This might actually be my favorite addition to this army so far. I can't really put my finger on why that is, but I just really love how he's come out. And I think the angry guard dog squig works really well with the Commissar aesthetic. I think it's also the most fun I've had kitbashing and painting a miniature in this army build, which may be influencing my feelings towards him outside of his actual usefulness. But yeah, it was really enjoyable to be able to put all of my attention into kitbashing and painting that one small miniature for the army, trying to make him look as good as I can without having to worry about how long it was going to take me to do so. I'm also happy to see how my sculpting skills are progressing. You know, this is nothing groundbreaking at all, but in the past I would have relied on buying multiple kits to get the parts I needed for the coat and the hat and whatever else, but in this case I've been able to just take one miniature I had left over from previous builds and use some green stuff and milliput to transform him into the vision I have in my head. So yeah, really enjoyable build all round this time, and I am very glad to have this guy in my army. If you enjoyed this process as much as I did, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment, because if you don't, a snail might crawl onto your face and poo on it in the middle of the night. I've seen it happen. Also, let me know what you'd add to this swampy army next, and what you had for breakfast on the 15th of January 2013. But for now, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.